Alright, I think we are recording here. So, we're looking at Chapter 2, The Chemistry of Life. This is basically an overview of basic chemistry, so atoms and stuff like that, and then we're going to look at some macromolecules. And it would probably help if I made this full screen. Let's see if we can get a full screen. There we go. So, a few objectives here in the first section. We're going to look at atoms and isotopes and compounds, and then we're going to look at a couple different types of bonds. So this is an atom. They're made up of protons, neutrons, and electrons. An atom is the most basic unit of matter, and the protons are going to be shown with a little plus symbol because they are positively charged. Neutrons have no charge, and then electrons around in the outside electron cloud are going to have a little minus symbol because they are negatively charged. So at the center is this nucleus. It's made up of protons and neutrons. Here we have 6 protons, 6 neutrons, 6 electrons. Because they have equal numbers of electrons and protons, they're electrically neutral, so this does not have a charge. There is a misconception that electrons travel in specific orbits around the nucleus. They're really just kind of floating around in this electron cloud. The attraction between these protons and the electrons is what holds the electrons to the nucleus. The atomic number is the same as the amount of protons in the nucleus. So here our atomic number is 6. Now elements are pure substances. They only take up one type of atom, but there are different forms of them. So here our atomic number is 6. The mass can be determined by adding the number of protons and neutrons. So here, if you added the 6 protons plus 6 neutrons, you would get a mass of 12. Normally, in the picture that we see here in an atom, you're going to have equal numbers of protons, neutrons, and electrons, and so the net charge is going to be 0. However, sometimes this is a little bit different, and we have these isotopes. So isotopes have the same number of electrons, but they have different neutron numbers. So for example, carbon always has 6 protons. Because there are different neutron numbers, you see those here, the mass is going to be different for each of these isotopes. So here there are 6 neutrons. 6 plus 6 is 12. This is the mass number right here. 6 plus 7 neutrons is a mass of 13. This radioactive means that it has an unstable nuclei, and so it gives off extra energy by spontaneously emitting radiation in the form of either alpha, beta, or gamma rays, and this can be dangerous because radiation is damaging to our bodies. Some of these are found in nature. Most are products of nuclear reactions, and they can be used for things like medicine and electrical power. Chemical compounds are normally shown using a chemical formula. So for example, water is written as H2O. Both oxygen and hydrogen are gases, but when they combine, they form liquid. They're combined with these bonds, and there's 2 main types of bonds. There are ionic and covalent bonds, and bonding is important because the energy that these compounds use, the energy that we use, comes from the substance ATP, which is held in those bonds. So an ionic bond is when one or more electrons are transferred from one atom to another, and we're going to look at this right here. So sodium has 11 electrons. If you compare the protons and the electrons, that gives you a charge of 0. Chlorine has 17, again, charge of 0. But sodium easily loses one of these, and it can transfer it to this chlorine. So now the sodium only has 10 electrons because it gave this one up. And the chloride has gained an electron, that's why its name changed. And now they have different charges. So the sodium has a +1 charge and this one has a -1 charge or a -1 charge. Because one electron was transferred to the chloride, it's an ionic bond. And because these negative and positive charges attract to each other, like opposites attract, that also helps create that bond. A covalent bond is when atoms share electrons. So here, this hydrogen has 1 proton and it has 1 electron. The oxygen has 8 protons, and if you count these, including these two right here, it also has 8 electrons. Now, if each hydrogen in this image has 1 electron and the oxygen has 8, then there's 10 total in this model. And they're going to be shared between the hydrogen and the oxygen. So because they're being shared, it's a covalent bond. Ionic bonds can be summarized kind of as like opposites attract, like magnets. Covalent bonds are like 2 people sharing an umbrella. All right, so section 2 is a little bit on properties of water. Here we have a water molecule. Water is made up of the 2 hydrogens. This is what we just looked at, 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. We have equal protons and electrons in both, 10 electrons total, and it's going to have an overall positive charge. Now, protons here in the nucleus are going to attract electrons. So, because oxygen has 8 protons and hydrogen has less, the electrons are more attracted to the oxygen. This means that the electrons are going to spend more time around the oxygen atom. Because it spends more time here, this oxygen pole is negative and these are positive, and it kind of creates that vent shape. Water bonds using hydrogen bonds. So it's polar. That is the shape that we just saw. The hydrogen is positively charged. Let's see if I can find it. Hydrogen positive, oxygen negative. These 2 forces attract, the positive and the negative attract to each other because they are partial charges, and they allow for these hydrogen bonds to form. So this is one of water's special properties. These are similar to ionic bonds because electrons are being kind of transferred by the charges. However, they're a lot weaker than the ionic bonds. A couple of cool properties of water. One is cohesion. This is attraction between molecules of the same substance. So water can form up to 4 hydrogen bonds with other water molecules, and it makes it cohesive, and this allows for surface tension. So that's how things like little spiders can float on the top of water. The strong attraction between the water molecules results in that surface tension. The second neat quality of water is adhesion. Adhesion is the attraction between molecules of different substances. So in this picture, you see an example of adhesion. If you notice, these 3 tubes are a different size, and the smaller the size, the higher the water has climbed up this tube. It rises higher in the narrower tube because the water has more surface area interacting with the glass from the tube, so it allows it to climb higher up. It is kind of using itself and bonding with the glass to kind of defy gravity. And it creates this meniscus, and you can't really tell very well, but it's kind of like a dip. And that dip is present because the water molecules on the side have adhered to the glass. The adhesion and cohesion are both attractions between molecules. One is of the same substance, one is different substances. So for example, for adhesion, water sticks to plant veins and travels up a plant in that way. So using adhesion to stick to the veins and then cohesion to stick to itself to continue traveling against the force of gravity. There's also heat capacity. So this is the amount of heat it takes to raise the temperature. It takes a really large amount of heat to raise the temperature of water. Molecules have to move faster for the water of temperature to rise, and the hydrogen bonds make this harder because they have to move faster. There's a stronger resistance to temperature change because of this. So large bodies of water can absorb a lot of energy without having huge temperature changes. Now, when heat is absorbed, bonds break, and when heat is released, bonds form. So to raise the temperature of water, bonds have to break. Water heats up a little bit, but it absorbs a lot of heat. So when it cools down, the molecules slow down and hydrogen bonds form, which also releases heat. So cooling water releases heat, and that's why beaches have milder climates than other places more inland. This also is really beneficial in moderating ocean temperatures and our own body temperature because we are about 60% water. When you mix things, you are creating a solution. So, for example, here, sodium and chloride were mixed in water. So sodium chloride is salt. The salt seems to disappear in the water because its ions are breaking apart and they're moving and spreading throughout the water, and so you don't really see them. The chloride bonds with the water molecules, and the sodium will bond with oxygen. The chloride will bond with the hydrogen, and the sodium binds with the oxygen molecules. So because hydrogen has a partial positive charge, it's attracted to the negative charge of the chloride. And oxygen has a partial negative charge, and so it's attracted to the positive charge of the sodium. Water is a really good solvent, a versatile solvent, because of this polarity of its water molecules. And then we have pH. So pH is a measure of the hydrogen ion concentration in something. Acids have a higher concentration of hydrogen. Bases have a lower concentration. So here's our pH scale. The lower numbers are more acidic, 7 is neutral, higher numbers are more basic. Water is neutral, our blood is neutral. Things like tomatoes, stomach acid, lemons, those are going to be your acids. Things like milk are going to be very basic. Sometimes we need buffers. Buffers are weak acids or bases that can be added to a stronger acid or base to kind of neutralize it, and it helps prevent sudden changes in pH. So it's really important that our blood is a neutral pH. Sometimes our bodies get kind of out of whack and we become more acidic or more basic, and buffers can help bring us back to homeostasis or back to balance without creating more issues. All right, carbon compounds. So this is the main stuff that we're going to be looking at in this chapter, in this unit. Carbon compounds can have many names. Organic compounds, macromolecules, biomolecules. If you are in my class, I like to call them macros. These are any compound that contains carbon, and they can bond with other elements to create compounds. So on here you see these lines. These lines are pointing at different covalent bonds. They can be single bonds, double bonds, or triple. Now, the carbon can form up to 4 different covalent bonds, so that's why this has a triple bond. So 1, 2, 3, 4 bonds, 1, 2, 3, 4 bonds. And there's different structures that allow for the carbon to bond up to 4 times. So you can have a straight chain, a ring, or a branch chain. Macromolecules are large organic molecules that are found in living things, and they're built by polymerization. So here you actually see this polymerization process. It's made, one large thing is made from several smaller things. So monomers, mono is one, are the building blocks for these polymers. Poly is many. So like a paperclip chain. One paperclip would be your monomer, the entire chain would be your polymer. This polymerization typically occurs in one of 2 ways. Either hydrolysis, so polymers can be broken down, and this uses water, or a condensation reaction, and this means that monomers are combined into polymers and water is released. These are sometimes called dehydration reactions because it's being dehydrated. It's losing the water. Now, there's 4 main macros: carbs, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Carbohydrates are made up of monosaccharides, or one sugar. Saccharide means sugar, so it's simple sugar. These are things like glucose, fructose, basic sugars. Carbs are useful for short-term energy. It's like quick energy. So people carb load before they run or do, athletic things like football. You can eat a whole bunch of pasta or bread or something, and it gives you like a quick burst of energy. If you don't use all of the carbs that you eat, though, they're converted into fats. They are made up of the elements carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. You can determine what they are by looking at their structure. So they have a ring structure. You also find them in a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. So for every 1 carbon, there are 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. And they also end in ose. So glucose, fructose, sucrose, cellulose, galactose, OSE. They also provide about 4 kilocalories per gram of energy. Now, this is the monomer picture. This is the simple ring structure. When they're all linked together, it makes a polysaccharide or a complex carb. This is like sugar or cellulose. Cellulose is what builds plant cell walls. Let's see, lipids. Lipids are made of a glycerol and fatty acid tails. They provide a long-term energy. They can be used when there are no carbs available to use for energy. They're also good for cushioning your organs. It's healthy to have some fats. And for insulation. A lot of animals rely on having a large lipid store to keep them warm. They are also made of the elements carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. They can be defined by their hydrophobic tails. So the tails are made of water and a hydrophilic head. The tails are afraid of water. The hydrophilic head is not scared of water. It kind of enjoys it. So we'll talk more about this structure when we talk about membranes. These have 9 kilocalories of energy per gram. So the more bonds that there are, and you see way more bonds in this than you did here in the carbohydrate, the more energy that it provides. So there are 2 types of fats, saturated and unsaturated. Saturated fats are considered to be the bad fats because they pack together really well into solids, and they can clog arteries and cause health issues. These are going to be animal-based fats, things like butters and meat. Unsaturated fats can be considered good fats because they remain a liquid and they flow really well through your arteries. These are going to be like fish or other plant-based things like olive oil or cashews, things like that. Proteins are made up of amino acids, and these amino acids are linked by peptide bonds. So a chain of amino acids is called a polypeptide chain. So sometimes you might hear a protein being referred to as a polypeptide chain. They are used as building blocks. They're really good for building bone, for building muscle, hormones. They're used as enzymes, and we're going to get to enzymes in just a second. They are made up of the elements carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, sometimes sulfur. They can be defined by their shape. So they all have an R group. They have an amino group and a carboxyl group. And they also provide 4 kilocalories of energy per gram. There are different types of proteins. There's more than 20 different amino acids found in nature that make proteins. Our body makes 12. So the rest you have to get from your food. Now, there are different types of proteins. They have different jobs. Structural proteins are used for support like connective tissue and keratin, so like hair and nails. Transport proteins move substances through the body. So, like hemoglobin moves oxygen from lungs to other parts of your body. Hormones coordinate your bodily activities. So, like insulin helps regulate the amount of sugar in your body. Contractile proteins help control movement, so proteins in your muscles. And then enzymatic proteins, these are your enzymes. We're going to talk about those in just a minute. Those help accelerate the speed of reactions. And an example would be like breaking down food in your digestive tract. The last macro is a nucleic acid. These are made of nucleotides. They are used for energy storage. They store and transfer genetic information. They're made up of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Their shape is a 5-carbon sugar, nitrogen base, and a phosphate group. They don't provide any energy. These are going to be things like DNA and RNA, your genetic information. Here's a quick overview. Elements, monomer, job, energy. Last, we're going to talk about chemical reactions. So, chemical reactions happen when one set of chemicals is changed into another set. These involve changes in energy. So, there's either going to be a release or a use of energy. The elements that go into a reaction are called the reactants. So, here we have carbon dioxide and water going into this reaction, reactants. What comes out is the product. An example of an important chemical reaction that helps carry carbon dioxide from your cells so that it can be removed is being shown in this diagram. So carbon dioxide is going to come into your bloodstream from your body tissues. It's going to bind to, where's my mouse? Here it is. It's going to bind to water, and that forms this carbonic acid. This travels through your bloodstream into your lungs, and it's broken back down into carbon dioxide and water. So here we have 2 graphs. The high point of each graph shows how much energy it takes for the reaction to happen. So the difference between the energy it needs to happen and where it's beginning is called the activation energy. There are 2 types of these reactions. You have energy absorbing and energy releasing. This is an energy absorbing reaction. So it can also be called an endergonic reaction. Energy has to be absorbed for the reaction to happen. We can see this because there is more energy in our product than there was in the reactant. So it's taking in energy. The second graph is an energy releasing graph. So products have less energy than the reactants. Heat can be released as, energy can be released as heat or light. Organisms have to carry out reactions all the time, so we're constantly converting energy. Let me think. So this reaction can actually happen spontaneously. You might think that spontaneous means immediate. It does not. Spontaneous reactions are not always rapid. They can actually take a really long time. So, for example, diamonds spontaneously decay into graphite, but that takes millions of years. So, main idea from this slide, activation energy is what you need to get a reaction going. Here we have 2 energy absorbing reactions happening. They are occurring spontaneously. You don't need added energy for the reaction to occur. And there's a difference between these 2. So this one takes less activation energy. This one is using a catalyst. A catalyst is something that speeds up a chemical reaction, and it does this by lowering that activation energy. And this can be really helpful in reactions that require really large amounts of activation energy. Enzymes are proteins. Enzymes actually also act as catalysts in living things. So they speed up reactions in our cells, and they do this by lowering activation energy. And that allows many more molecules to react. So we can have our chemical reactions in our body happening in a more timely manner. It changes the activation energy, but it doesn't really change the overall energy between the reactants and the products. So again, enzymes in the body. This reaction has an enzyme helping remove the carbon dioxide from the body. It's necessary so that this happens in a reasonable time. If not, this carbon dioxide could make us sick. Enzymes are also super specific. So each enzyme is going to only bind with one particular substrate. The substrate is what it binds with. This arrow indicates a reaction that will be catalyzed by an enzyme. This also would be catalyzed by an enzyme. They require them because otherwise it would take too long to occur. Like I've said already, the carbon dioxide can make us sick. Here is a sample diagram of how an enzyme works. So it is shown in a cycle because these enzymes can be recycled over and over again unless they are denatured. Now, denatured means that their shape has changed, and there are two main ways that this can happen, either because of temperature, so they get too hot, or pH changes their shape. So a substrate is the reactant of an enzyme catalyzed reaction. It's what's being either broken apart or sometimes joined together. The enzyme substrate complex is being modeled when the enzyme and the substrate fit together. So the substrate fits into this little active site perfectly. And the enzyme is going to work to convert the substrate into products, again, by either breaking them apart or joining them together. So enzyme substrate complex, they are converted, released, and it can happen again. The enzymes sometimes are described as a lock and key model because they're so very specific. One key fits just one lock, just like one substrate fits one enzyme. So remember, the substrate is what's being worked on, and the enzyme is doing the work. This is really a simplified representation of what's happening, but it's still a good model. And again, sometimes this enzyme can get messed up by things like temperature and pH. And when it's changed or when it's denatured, then it can't fit its substrate properly and it doesn't do its job well. So, to recap, we talked a little bit about atoms and different types of bonds that create compounds. We talked about the 4 macros, your carbs, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids, and then we talked a little bit about enzymes. So enzymes are these catalysts that are speeding up reactions by helping lower the energy that it takes them to get started. Next up, we'll be talking a little bit about cells.